Lady Elara Sterling stood in the corner of her uncle's ballroom, a ghost haunting the edges of a festival. The music, a sprightly waltz, felt like a mockery. The laughter of the bejeweled guests sounded like the chatter of birds in a language she no longer understood. She had been a part of this world once, but that felt like a lifetime ago. Now, she was simply a fixture, a piece of unfortunate furniture her uncle, Lord Vernon, was occasionally forced to display. Her gown was a cast-off, a pale grey silk that had been fashionable 3 seasons prior. It was meticulously clean, thanks to her own careful hands, but it screamed of genteel poverty. It was the colour of ashes, and Elara felt she was little more than that. The cold remains of a fire that had been extinguished too soon. Her father, a scholar with more books than sense, had left her with nothing but debts and a mind too sharp for her own good. Her one and only season had ended in disaster. A broken engagement fueled by vicious, untrue rumours that had clung to her like a shroud. At 24, she was a spinster, a burden, a whisper in the hallways of the grand house she was allowed to inhabit, but never truly call home. Her fingers tightened around the stem of the untouched champagne flute in her hand, the glass cool against her clammy skin. She was waiting for the evening to end, for the blessed silence of her small attic room, for the moment she could shed this pretense and simply cease to be for a few hours. Lord Vernon was holding court near the grand fireplace, his face flushed with wine and self-importance. He was a man who measured his worth in the envy of others, and Elara, his unfortunate niece, was a stain on his otherwise pristine canvas of social success. She saw his eyes, small and hard like a boar's, flick toward her. A familiar dread coiled in her stomach. He had been in a foul mood all week, and his gaze promised a storm. He laughed, a booming, artificial sound that made several nearby ladies flinch. He clapped a portly baron on the back. "You see?" Lord Vernon gestured vaguely in Elara's direction, his voice carrying across a lull in the music. "The last of the Sterling legacy. A fine mind, they say. Though what good is a mind when a face fails to launch a single ship, eh?" A few nervous titters followed. Elara's heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She willed the floor to swallow her whole. She wanted to disappear, to dissolve into the cloying, rose-scented air. She kept her eyes fixed on a point on the far wall, a gilt-framed painting of a serene countryside she could never reach. "She eats like a horse and reads books all day," her uncle continued, his voice rising with theatrical despair. "What am I to do with her?" "A man cannot be expected to carry such a weight indefinitely." He took a long swallow of his wine, then slammed the glass down on a nearby table. The sound cracked through the room. Silence began to spread from him like a stain. The music faltered. The dancers slowed. Every eye in the room, it seemed, turned first to the florid face of Lord Vernon, and then to the pale, still figure in the corner. To her. Elara felt 1,000 needles prick her skin. This was it. The ultimate humiliation. He was going to cast her out, here, in front of everyone. "I am a generous man," Lord Vernon declared, his words slurring slightly. "Too generous. She has cost me a fortune in heartache and mutton. So, here is my offer." He swept his arm out, a grand, dismissive gesture. "Give her to anyone. Anyone at all who will take this blue stocking off my hands. A dowry of relief is all I ask." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a thick, suffocating thing, heavier than any sound. It was the silence of horror, of pity, of scandalized glee. Elara's breath caught in her throat. The world narrowed to the pounding in her ears and the burn of 100 pairs of eyes. She was a slab of meat at market, a faulty piece of goods being discarded. She stood there, waiting to be handed off like she meant nothing. Then she heard a voice. It was not loud, but it cut through the silence with the clean, sharp edge of a diamond cutting glass. It was deep, calm, and held an authority that was unmistakable. "I will take her." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Alara's head snapped up, her eyes searching for the source of the impossible words. In the far corner, a shadow detached itself from the wall. A tall, imposing figure stepped into the light. He had been there all evening, a silent observer whom everyone had been studiously ignoring, too intimidated to approach. Duke Alistair Beaumont, the Iron Duke. The wealthiest, most powerful, and most reclusive man in all of England. A man whose face, usually set in lines of cold discipline, was as famous as his vast fortune. He never attended such frivolous events. His presence alone had been the subject of speculation all night. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, his dark evening clothes making him seem like a creature of the night. His eyes, the colour of a winter storm, were fixed not on Lord Vernon, but directly on her. He took another step forward, his gaze never wavering. And then he spoke again, his voice carrying to every corner of the now deathly quiet room. Each word a perfectly formed, perfectly weighted stone dropped into a frozen pond. He said her name. Lady Alara. The room went silent in a way it had not been before. It was not the silence of shock, but of awe. He had not said the girl or the niece. He had said her name. He had acknowledged her existence, her title, her personhood, in a room where she had just been rendered an object. Alara could only stare, her champagne flute slipping from her numb fingers and shattering on the polished floor. Duke Alistair Beaumont, a man who could have any woman in the kingdom, a man who moved in spheres so far above her own, they might as well have been on different planets, had just claimed her. And as he stood there, his stormy eyes holding hers, she felt a terrifying, unfamiliar flicker of something that was not despair. Lord Vernon's jaw had dropped, his ruddy face paling to a sickly white. He looked from the terrifyingly composed Duke to his niece and back again, as if he had just witnessed a statue stepping off its pedestal. The Duke did not wait for her uncle's permission. He did not acknowledge the stunned crowd. His focus was solely, terrifyingly, on Alara. He walked across the floor, the sound of his shoes a steady, resolute rhythm against the marble. He stopped a respectful distance from her, yet his presence felt as if it enveloped her completely. "Lady Alara," he said again, his voice softer now, meant only for her. "Your uncle has made an offer. I have accepted. If you will permit me, I will see you away from this place." He was not asking, he was stating a fact, but the polite phrasing gave her the illusion of choice. A choice she had not had in years. She looked at his face. It was as cold and unreadable as the rumors suggested, a mask of aristocratic discipline. But his eyes, in their depths, there was something other than ice. A flicker of… what? She could not name it. She could only nod. A single, jerky movement. Words had abandoned her. He extended a gloved hand. It was a gesture of pure, formal courtesy, yet it felt like a lifeline. Slowly, as if waking from a long dream, she placed her trembling fingers in his. His grip was firm, secure. A sudden, unexpected warmth spread from his touch, chasing away some of the profound chill that had settled in her bones. Without a word to anyone else, he turned and led her from the ballroom. The crowd parted for them, as if the Red Sea were cleaving for Moses. Whispers erupted in their wake, a sudden torrent after a long drought, but the Duke paid them no mind. He moved with an unhurried purpose, shielding her from the curious stares with the sheer force of his presence. He led her to the grand entrance hall, where a footman, his eyes wide with shock, scrambled to fetch her worn cloak. The Duke took it from the boy and, with a startlingly gentle movement, draped it over her shoulders himself. His fingers brushed the nape of her neck, a spark of contact that made her flinch. "My carriage is waiting," he said, his voice a low rumble beside her ear. The journey to his London residence, Beaumont House, was a study in silence. Elara sat perfectly still on the plush velvet squabs, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The carriage was cavernously large, the air inside smelling faintly of leather and winter frost. The Duke sat opposite her, a formidable silhouette against the flickering gaslights of the city streets. He did not speak, he simply watched her. His gaze was not predatory or leering, but something far more unnerving. It was analytical. He looked at her as a scholar might look at a rare text, searching for something hidden within the lines. Elara felt stripped bare, more exposed in the quiet intimacy of this carriage than she had been under the glare of the entire ballroom. What did he want? Why had he done it? The questions screamed in her mind, but she dared not voice them. The Iron Duke was not a man one interrogated. He was a force of nature, and she was a leaf caught in his current. Beaumont House was less a house and more a fortress of pale stone and dark marble. It loomed over the square, cold and magnificent, seeming to absorb the light and sound around it. Inside, the silence was even more profound. A severe-looking butler led them through a hall of statues that looked like captured souls, and into a vast, intimidating library. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, thousands upon thousands of them, their leather spines gleaming like a dragon's hoard. A fire crackled in a hearth large enough to roast an ox, but it did little to warm the cavernous space. The Duke dismissed the butler with a nod. He stood by the fire, one hand resting on the marble mantelpiece. He finally broke the long silence. "I apologize for the public nature of what transpired," he said, his voice as crisp as the pages of a new book. "Your uncle left me little choice." Elara found her voice, though it was a mere whisper. "Your Grace, I do not understand." He turned to face her fully. "It is quite simple, Lady Elara. I find myself in need of a duchess. You find yourself in need of rescue. I am proposing a solution to our mutual predicaments." Elara stared at him, bewildered. A solution?" "A marriage," he stated, the word utterly devoid of any romantic connotation. It was a business term, a contract. "I will give you my name, my protection, and the full resources of my station. You will never be subject to the whims of men like your uncle again. Your life will be your own, within the walls of my homes. You will want for nothing." It was the most extraordinary, insane proposition she had ever heard. He was offering her a golden cage in exchange for her leaden one. "And in return?" she asked, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. She was her father's daughter, after all. She understood that every transaction had two sides. A flicker of something, was it approval, crossed his features. "In return, you will be my duchess. You will manage my households, host the necessary events when I require it, and provide a veneer of domestic tranquility. You will be a partner in a business arrangement. There will be no other demands. Our marriage will be in name only." He was offering her everything and asking for nothing she truly valued. He was offering her freedom, cloaked in the guise of matrimony. Freedom from hunger, from humiliation, from fear. "Why me?" she breathed, the question that had been tormenting her. "You could have anyone, any debutante from any great family." He looked away from her then, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "The debutantes of the season do not interest me, Lady Alara. Their ambitions are tiresome. I require a duchess of intelligence, resilience, and quiet strength. I have observed you for some time. You possess these qualities in abundance." He had observed her. The thought sent a strange shiver through her. The invisible girl, seen by the one man no one could ignore. There was no real choice. Her alternative was to return to her uncle's house, to face his wrath and an even more certain ruin. This was not a proposal. It was a port in a hurricane. "I accept," she said, the words feeling foreign and momentous on her tongue. A barely perceptible nod was his only reply. "Excellent. We shall be married by special license at the end of the week." And just like that, her life was sold once more. But this time, she wondered if, perhaps, she had been bought. The days that followed were a blur of formal arrangements. Lawyers came and went with documents that transferred her from a state of penury to one of unimaginable wealth. A dressmaker, a quiet Frenchwoman with reverent hands, appeared and created a simple, elegant wedding gown of cream-colored wool. Alara moved through it all in a daze, a pawn in a game whose rules she was only just beginning to learn. They were married in the Duke's private chapel, a cold, beautiful space of stained glass and ancient stone. The only attendees were a solicitor and Alara's new lady's maid, a quiet, kind-faced woman named Anna. The Duke stood beside her, a pillar of granite and resolve. When he slipped the heavy gold band onto her finger, his touch was cool and impersonal. He was now her husband. She was a duchess. It felt like a role in a play. Their new life together began with the same formal distance that had defined their proposal. They were the Duchess and Duke of Beaumont, two celestial bodies orbiting a shared sun of duty and title, but never touching. They took their meals together in a dining room so long that they needed to raise their voices to be heard, so they mostly ate in silence. Alara, now the Duchess of Beaumont, spent her days exploring her new domain. Beaumont House was a labyrinth of art, history, and sorrow. It was magnificent but lifeless. She felt its loneliness seep into her own. She was mistress of it all, but it did not feel like a home. It felt like a museum of one man's solitude. She found herself drawn, again and again, to the library. It was the one room that felt truly alive, imbued with the spirits of the authors and thinkers who lined its shelves. She would run her fingers over the spines, breathing in the scent of old paper and leather. This was a language she understood. One afternoon, she found a section of shelves locked behind an ornate iron grille. It seemed to be the Duke's personal collection, filled with rarer, older volumes. She felt a pang of disappointment. Another door closed to her. The next morning, at breakfast, a small, heavy, wrought iron key lay next to her plate. She looked up, questioning, at the Duke at the far end of the table. He was reading a letter, his face impassive. He did not look at her, but he spoke, his voice calm and even. "The lock on the west shelves is prone to sticking," he said, as if commenting on the weather. "It requires a delicate touch." Alara stared at the key. It was a small thing, but it felt momentous. It was an invitation, an acknowledgement. He had seen her interest, and instead of forbidding it, he had quietly granted her access. Her fingers closed around the cool metal. That afternoon, she unlocked the grille. Inside were not just books, but folios of architectural drawings, treatises on botany, and collections of poetry in languages she had only dreamed of reading. It was the library of a man with a deep and curious mind. A mind, she realized with a jolt, much like her own. This was the first crack in his iron facade. Small, almost imperceptible, but there. The second came a week later. Ilara had always found solace in sketching. In her old life, she had used scraps of paper and bits of charcoal, hiding her drawings like a guilty secret. Here, in this grand house, she had not dared. It felt too frivolous, too personal. But the urge was strong. One rainy afternoon, tucked away in a small, sunless parlor, she took out a piece of stationery and a pencil from a desk and began to sketch the face of a stone gargoyle she could see from the window. She became so absorbed she did not hear the door open. "I was not aware you were an artist." His voice made her jump, and she quickly tried to hide the drawing. A flush of shame and fear washed over her. She expected a reprimand for her idleness, for using his stationery. He walked over and stood behind her. She held her breath. He did not speak for a long moment. Then he simply said, "The perspective is quite good," and left the room. Ilara was left trembling, her heart pounding. The next day, Anna informed her that a room on the third floor, one with perfect northern light, had been cleared for her use. Inside, she found a sturdy easel, stacks of high-quality paper, and a complete set of charcoal, graphite, and watercolor paints. There was no note. There was no explanation. There was only the silent, overwhelming evidence of his quiet observation and startling generosity. He had seen her secret passion and had not just permitted it, he had nurtured it. A strange, warm feeling bloomed in her chest, something she was afraid to name. Their arrangement, however, was not without its trials. Society was ravenous for details of the Iron Duke's shocking marriage. Their first public appearance together was at a ball hosted by a viscount. As they entered, the entire room fell silent. Ilara's hand tightened on Alistair's arm, the memory of her uncle's party a fresh wound. He paused at the entrance, his presence a bulwark against the sea of staring faces. He leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. "Hold your head high, Duchess," he murmured, his voice a low command. "You are their better in every way. Let them stare." His words, and the solid strength of his arm beneath her hand, gave her a courage she did not know she possessed. She lifted her chin, met the curious gazes, and walked into the room as if she belonged there. Because, she realized with a start, she did. She was the Duchess of Beaumont. But not everyone was so easily cowed. Lady Covington, a notorious gossip whose own daughter had been considered a prime candidate for the ducal title, approached them later in the evening. Her smile was sharp, her eyes malicious. "Your Grace," she said to Alistair, her voice dripping with false sweetness, before turning a dismissive eye on Ilara. "And the new Duchess. How wonderful to see you out. One hears such stories. A true fairy tale, is it not? From rags to riches." She let the insult hang in the air. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. Before she could think of a reply, Alistair acted. He did not raise his voice. He did not cause a scene. He simply turned the full force of his chilling gaze upon Lady Covington. "Lady Covington," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "My wife's lineage is as noble as your own, though her character, I am pleased to say, is vastly superior. And she is not merely rich. She is the custodian of the Beaumont fortune. A fortune, I might add, that holds the mortgages on 3 of your husband's less profitable estates. Do enjoy the canapés. I hear they are particularly fine tonight. Lady Covington paled, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Without another word, Alistair placed a proprietary hand on the small of Ilara's back and steered her away, leaving the woman sputtering in their wake. In the carriage on the way home, the silence returned, but it was different. It was charged with the energy of what had just happened. He had defended her, not just her position, but her. He had called her his wife and spoken of her character. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. He merely inclined his head, his face shrouded in shadow. But she thought she saw the rigid line of his jaw soften, just for a moment. The seeds of doubt, however, were sown by a more intimate hand. Her mother's sister, Aunt Beatrice, a woman whose concern was always laced with a healthy dose of morbid curiosity, was finally permitted to call on her. Aunt Beatrice surveyed the lavish drawing room with wide eyes, her fingers stroking a velvet cushion as if to test its reality. "Well, Ilara, you've certainly landed on your feet. Who would have thought it?" "The Duke has been very kind," Ilara said, pouring tea. "Kind?" Her aunt scoffed lightly. "Men like the Duke of Beaumont are not kind, my dear. They are strategic. What does he want from you? There must be a reason. A man like that does not pluck a penniless niece from obscurity out of the goodness of his heart." The words were like small, sharp stones hitting the fragile glass of Ilara's newfound security. "Perhaps he is lonely," her aunt mused, tapping a finger against her lips. "Or perhaps there is some secret, some flaw in you that he requires. A barren wife, perhaps, so he need not worry about a legitimate heir while he enjoys his companions." The insinuation was vile, and it struck a chord of fear deep within Ilara. The Duke had been clear their marriage was in name only. He had never once approached her bedchamber. Was her aunt right? Was she merely a convenient, barren placeholder? "He is a good man," Ilara insisted, her voice tighter than she intended. "Oh, I'm sure," her aunt said placatingly. "But be careful, dear. Such grand houses have dark corners, and men like the Duke have the darkest secrets of all." Her aunt's words lingered long after she left, a poison seeping into the quiet spaces of Ilara's mind. She started watching her husband with new eyes, searching for the sinister motive, the hidden truth. But all she saw was the same disciplined, contained man. A man who left books for her to find, who stocked her studio with supplies, who defended her honor with icy precision. His actions and the supposed dark motive did not align. The uncertainty became a constant, low-grade fever. She could not live like this, in a state of perpetual gratitude and suspicion. She needed to know the truth, whatever it was. She deserved that much. One night, she could bear it no longer. A storm raged outside, rattling the window panes, mirroring the tempest in her soul. She knew he would be in the library, as he was most nights. She found him there, sitting in a worn leather armchair by the fire, a book lying open in his lap. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Duchess," he acknowledged, his voice calm. "Is something amiss?" She walked to the center of the room, her hands clasped before her to stop their shaking. "Everything is amiss, Your Grace. I am amiss." She had his full attention now. He closed his book, marking his page with a finger. "Explain." "This marriage, this house, your kindness," she said, the word feeling inadequate. "I do not understand it." I cannot live as a ghost in my own life any longer. I must know the truth. Her heart was pounding so hard she felt it in her throat. This was it. She was confronting the lion in his den. You saved me, she pressed on, her voice gaining strength. You gave me a name, a home, protection. You have given me gifts I never dreamed of. Why? Why me? You could have had anyone in England. Why did you choose a disgraced, penniless spinster from a ballroom floor? He was silent for a long time, his eyes searching her face. The firelight cast flickering shadows across his features, making him seem both older and more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with an emotion she could not identify. Because it had to be you. It could only ever have been you. Elara stared, uncomprehending. I don't understand. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, staring out at the storm-lashed darkness. 15 years ago, he began, his voice distant. I was not the Duke. I was Alistair Beaumont, a second son with no prospects, studying philosophy at Oxford. My future was the church or the army. My life was books. He paused, and Elara held her breath. There was a scholar there, he continued, a brilliant man, a historian with a passion for classical texts. His name was Arthur Sterling. Elara's breath hitched. My father? Yes, Alistair said, turning from the window to face her. Your father. We corresponded for years after he left the university. He wrote of his work, of his frustrations, of his greatest treasure, his daughter. A girl with a mind as bright as any scholar's, with a spirit that could not be contained. She felt a wave of dizziness. Her father had spoken of her to this man? I met you once, he said softly. Only once. It was at a small academic gathering. You could not have been more than 16. Your father had brought you along. You were engaged in a debate with Professor Albright on the Stoics. You were not intimidated. You were brilliant. You argued your points with a passion and clarity that silenced the entire room. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the mask of the Iron Duke completely fall away. In his eyes was the memory of a young man, lost and in awe. I was captivated, he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. I was a shy, awkward boy with nothing to offer. You were the most extraordinary person I had ever seen. I wanted to speak to you, to tell you, but I was a coward. What could a second son say to a girl who shone like the sun? He looked down at his hands, as if seeing them for the first time. So I did nothing. I watched you from afar. And then, my brother died in a hunting accident. Suddenly I was the heir. Then my father passed, and I was the Duke. I was drowning in duties I never wanted, wearing a title that felt like a suit of armor. I lost track of you. When I finally looked up from the mess of my new life, he went on, his voice filled with a deep, aching regret. You were engaged. I told myself it was for the best, that you were happy. Then the engagement was broken. I heard the rumors. Vicious, baseless lies. I knew they were lies. I knew the girl who debated philosophy could not be the creature they described. But I was a prisoner of my own title, of this cold, disciplined persona I had built to survive. The Iron Duke could not interfere in such trivial social matters, and so, again, I did nothing. He finally met her eyes, and the raw pain in them stole her breath. It has been the greatest shame of my life, Elara. Every day I saw you fade. I saw society chip away at you, saw your uncle's cruelty diminish the brilliant light I remembered. I watched you become a ghost, and I did nothing. He took a step toward her. That night, at your uncle's house, when he said those words, something inside me broke. My discipline, my control, my cowardice. It all shattered. I could not stand by and watch them destroy you completely. When he said, anyone, I knew my time for hiding was over. The truth washed over her, a staggering, overwhelming tide. It was not a strategy. It was not a business arrangement. It was not pity. It was this. A secret, 15-year-long devotion. A silent, unrequited love held by a man who thought himself a coward. The key to the library, the art supplies, the defense against Lady Covington. They were not the calculated acts of a duke. They were the desperate, clumsy offerings of a man who had loved her from afar for half her life. The marriage of convenience, she whispered, her throat tight. The demands, being in name only. A lie, he admitted, his voice ragged. The lie of a coward too terrified to tell you the truth. I wanted to offer you a sanctuary, a place where you could be free without the pressure of my feelings. I thought it was the only honorable thing I could do. To give you everything, except the one thing I was most afraid you would reject. Me. He stopped before her, his hands clenched at his sides. The great, powerful Iron Duke looked lost, exposed, and utterly vulnerable. I have loved you since I was a boy, Alara, and I have failed you at every turn. I am sorry. Tears were streaming down her face, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of profound, earth-shattering understanding. All this time, she had felt alone, invisible, but she had been seen. She had been cherished, from a distance, with a patience and depth that humbled her. She reached out and laid a hand on his chest, right over his heart. She could feel it beating, a strong, steady rhythm beneath her palm. You are not a coward, Alistair, she said, using his name for the first time. It felt right. It felt true. You were the only one who saw me when I had forgotten how to see myself. His eyes searched hers, filled with a desperate, burgeoning hope. I have not been living in a golden cage, she confessed, her own truth pouring out. I have been living in a house with a quiet, watchful man who gave me back my voice without my ever having to ask. I came to respect that man. I came to care for him, very deeply. A single tear escaped his tightly controlled composure and traced a path down his cheek. He made no move to wipe it away. Slowly, he lifted a hand and cupped her face, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. His touch was not cold or impersonal. It was shaking. It was full of a reverence that made her entire body tremble. Alara, he breathed, his voice thick with the weight of unspoken years. She leaned into his touch, closing the final inch between them. And then he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss of profound relief. It was gentle, hesitant, a question and an answer all at once. It spoke of years of silent observation, of aching regret, of a love so patient it had weathered a decade and a half of silence. She melted into him, her hands moving from his chest to wrap around his neck, holding him as if she could pour all her newfound strength and gratitude into him. When they finally broke apart, they rested their foreheads together, breathing the same air, the storm outside forgotten. The vast, lonely library was no longer cold. It was filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "I thought I was rescuing you," he murmured against her hair.
"And are you?"
she whispered back. A year later, the gardens of the Beaumont country estate were in full, glorious bloom. Alara, her hands smudged with dirt and her face glowing with sun, was directing a gardener on the placement of new rose bushes. Laughter, a sound once unheard in any of Beaumont's properties, echoed across the lawn. Alistair came down the stone steps, no longer the Iron Duke in his severe black coats, but a man in a simple linen shirt, his sleeves rolled to the elbows. He came to her and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "The West Terrace is looking decidedly less stoic," he commented, his voice warm with amusement. "It needed more passion and less philosophy," she retorted, leaning back against him. He turned her in his arms, his stormy eyes now the color of a warm summer sea. He looked at her not as a rare text, but as the author of his own happiness. The house behind them, once a cold monument, was now a home, its windows open to the light, its rooms filled with the scent of flowers and the sound of life. He had given her a name and a fortune, but she had given him something far more valuable. She had given him back his own heart. He was no longer a duke hiding behind a mask of iron, and she was no longer a ghost haunting the corners of rooms. They were simply Alistair and Alara. True freedom, she had learned, was not the absence of constraints, but the presence of a safe harbor. It was not about being rescued, but about finding the one person who saw you, truly saw you, and chose to stand with you in the storm. Their love had not been a sudden fire, but a slow, patient seed, planted long ago in a dusty university hall, that had finally, against all odds, been given the light and air it needed to grow. And it had bloomed into something more beautiful than either of them could have ever imagined.